you have others after this?
I think there's one more.
Perhaps one more. Anyway, this is both a kind of a work in progress demonstration, but it's also just as important an introduction. So I'm really delighted to introduce Elissa Auther, not just for today's event, but also to the institution. And one of the reasons that we wanted to shoehorn this in at the end of this year, pardon me, is to kind of unveil what we're really very proud of as a new, I would say, leg of the many-legged BGC stool. So Elissa Auther has recently joined the BGC and the Museum of Arts and Design as a MAD curator. She is also the MAD curator, the official name being the Wingate Research Curator, and I had the honor of meeting her when I sat on the committee to select such a person. And for those of you who maybe don't know the background of this, this was an initiative of Glenn Adamson when he became director of MAD on the heels of his time at the V&A, where he was director of the research department. And I think he had the very interesting and good idea that it's very helpful to have a curator specifically in charge of kind of research to really focus, give shape, and kind of help coordinate the many scholarly and research-based missions of MAD, and that seemed a completely logical way to partner with us. And I think until then, until this appointment, MAD has really been, you might say, the kind of the one obvious partner or sister institution in New York City with which we did not have a formal partnership. I think it's not speaking out of school to say that we even briefly considered relocating to that building. that didn't work out, but in any case, we feel a special relationship with MAD for many reasons. So Elissa is beginning a multi-year appointment, and the idea is that most of her time will be down there, but that she'll spend, and is already spending, what, about 1 day, 1.5 days, something like that, 2 days. And that obviously will depend a little bit, 2 days a week, that will depend a little bit on the teaching schedule. But really built into this appointment is one course a year, and that is going to be unveiled in the fall, since you came kind of halfway through the year. And I'll let you say more about that, but that is going to be a wonderful course called Curating from the Crypt, the Permanent Collection Exhibition. And you'll registering students will hear, are there any registering students here? None. All right, you can watch it on video. You were the audience for this event, but you're not here. They're upstairs buying books. In any case, spread the word, because this was in a sense to introduce Elissa to those who didn't know her but wondered what that course is. Let me tell you a little bit about her, and then I want to turn over the word to her. After earning a BA in History of Art at University of San Francisco, she continued in History of Art and got her PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park in 2000 with a specialty on modern and contemporary art, but very wisely a minor in 18th century French and British painting and decorative arts. Excellent choices. I'm sure that has honed your sensitivity to the nuances of materials and stuff. Anyway, in 2002, joined the Visual and Performing Arts Department at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and that is where she was plucked from for this MAD curator. And I can tell you, having sat on that committee, that when we were reviewing the applications and they saw one from Elissa Auther, who I confess I did not know, they were all extremely excited and thought, wow, we never thought we'd get her. But since she's in the pool, we have her. So you left there as Associate Professor of Contemporary Art, and that's really the area in which you've worked. And you, I think, in your own practice have kind of straddled the museum world, the contemporary curatorial world, and the art history world, being director of programs in art history museum studies at Colorado, but also for many years co-director of a project called Feminism and Company, Art, Sex, and Politics with the Museum of Contemporary Art. So maybe rather than me saying too much about your curatorial work, you could say a little bit about that. I'll just point out that work has been supplemented by grants from things like the Millard Meese Publication Fund from College Art Association, as well as Georgia O'Keeffe Museum and Research Fellowships. And I would just single out a couple of publications. In addition to a book, String, Felt, Thread, The Hierarchy of Art and Craft in American Art, a wonderful range of articles on topics including things like Andy Warhol wallpaper and contemporary installation art. And I think it's really that boundary between sort of contemporary art and other forms of practice that go under different names with different institutional structures, and you kind of work between. Other articles include From Design for Production, to off-limb sculpture, fiber art, and the hierarchy of craft, as I mentioned, co-editing a special issue on feminist activist art, radical craft as temporal drag, brief history of quilts and contemporary art, and so on. And also with Adam Lerner, co-edited a book called West of Center, Art and the Counterculture Experiment in America, 1965 to 1977. So that's enough intro. Tell us about what you want to tell us today, but do also tell us about yourself.
Sure.
And we will spread it to those who should be here but aren't.
Okay, so thinking about this as a kind of introduction, I prepared really a broad overview of my recent and current research and curatorial projects, some of which you've just mentioned. So I'm just going to sort of walk you through those projects, and I'm more than happy to answer questions or go into more detail during the question and answer period and talk about the class for the fall. So much of my research reflects my interests in objects and movements that fall outside of conventional definitions of art. So I've always been drawn to work that sits on the margins of the art world or falls between categories, especially art and craft. Sort of thought about it as a discounted or lesser form within the art world. And over time, I've discovered that these kinds of works pose questions that are interesting to me because they're fundamental really to the field of art history and our collective and personal experience of art and creative practice. And just to take an example, my first book, String Felt Thread, I looked at the use of fiber across a number of different artistic circles, circles that in the 60s and 70s that are never really talked about near each other or against each other, or side by side, let's say. And by doing that, by bringing them together, you can begin to look at questions of power and status, like how do hierarchies between art and craft really constitute and create or protect what we call art with a capital A. And also, why does this matter? Who does this matter to in the art world, and why do we maintain those boundaries or change them over time? So after String Felt Thread, I immersed myself in a research project on the American counterculture. And that culminated in a book and an exhibition. And it also focused on a wide variety of work that fell outside the mainstream world, much of it rooted in craft. And this is the cover of the book. The title was West of Center, Art and the Counterculture Experiment in America, and that was also the title of the exhibition. And both projects presented a very rich array of art and artifacts of the counterculture of the American West in the 60s and 70s. And I worked with Adam Lerner on both projects. He's the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. And we explored the various ways that creative practice was integral to counterculture efforts to recreate civilization from the ground up. And they did this, counterculturalists who were interested in creative practice really did this through a variety of forms of making and activities that were meant to foster personal, social, and political transformation. So the book featured 21 case studies, and the exhibition highlighted 8 examples of these artist collaborations to kind of reimagine what civilization could be. Design and craft, as I mentioned, were really an essential part of just about every counterculture activity you can name. So it was also a running theme throughout the exhibition, and then in the book there's an added sort of effort to call it out with a section that we titled Handmade Worlds. And within that section, I'll just show you some examples here of that work. I contributed an essay on the work of Paolo Soleri and his hand-cast concrete architecture of Cosanti and Arcosanti in Arizona. So these are examples of his work from Cosanti in Scottsdale, Arizona. On the right-hand side, there's also an inclusion of this area where ceramics and cast bronze objects were made. I think I have another image of that. Yeah, here's a more historical image of those hand-cast concrete structures. Really fascinating place that is still open to the public. There were a number of essays that focused on handmade worlds that are rooted in theatrical performance. So Julia Bryan Wilson contributed a wonderful essay on what she called like forms of queer craft, specifically looking at this theatrical group called the Cockettes. And they're imagining a way of living together that blended, or there was no separations between their like theatrical presentation on the stage and their theatrical presentation on the streets of Haight-Ashbury, where they lived in San Francisco. The leader of the group you see on the left, his name is Hibiscus, and then on the right-hand side, another section or sort of selection of the members. They were male, female, gay, straight, although they didn't really use those terms or categories, sort of rejected it for a concept of free love and something that you might use the term queer to describe today. This was their communal home in San Francisco. So they were part of a group of large communes that were members of like a free network within the city in terms of sharing resources, food, appliances, clothes, what have you. And it's a good example of how you might think of their theatrical costumes as costumes when in fact these really were just their everyday clothes. So there's this blending of sort of the theater and the everyday world.
And were the clothes themselves like handmade or?
A lot of them were, yeah, a lot of them were. And a lot of attention paid to that handmadeness. This is a famous photograph of one of the marches on the Pentagon, and this is Hibiscus, if you can believe it. So he stopped on his way from the East Coast to San Francisco. He's on this trip. He's there putting the daisy in the gun, and by the time he gets to San Francisco, here he is with his sort of preppy fisherman sweater. By the time he gets there, he renames himself Hibiscus and dresses, as a peacock. So there is this transformation of this move from the East Coast to the West Coast that the book also focuses on.
Where are you from?
I'm from Arizona. There's quite a bit of work related to hand-built architecture in this section of Handmade Worlds. This is the cover of the book. The painting in the front is a painting that spun on the ceiling, or was meant to spin on the ceiling of this particular dome, which was a theater dome used for sort of psychedelic light shows at a commune known as Drop City. So this is the first dome building community, and it was in southern Colorado, starting about 1964, and they built these domes out of car parts that they could sort of chop apart and put together. And they were obviously inspired by Buckminster Fuller, who had been in Boulder, Colorado a short time before this, and decided to start their own collective for their group. These were sculptors who sort of reimagined their practice as a form of dome building. Here's the panorama of Drop City in its heyday. And then the book also focuses on sort of the diaspora of dome building from southern Colorado out into Arizona and California. So these are just a variety of other sort of handmade domes. The craft and design also comes in a big way in sort of how-to publications that sort of exploded in this time period. So on the left-hand side, this is just one page from the Whole Earth catalog, probably from about 1968, where you can buy parts and how-to instructions for your own domes. On the right is just a page from a magazine that was called Dome Book, and there were 3 editions that sort of covered domes in the United States, especially on the West Coast, and had a variety of kind of how-to sort of instructions. The Dome Cookbook was written by Steve Bayer, who was a dome builder in New Mexico. And I put this in because the cookbook at the time was really the only known kind of how-to publication. So there's a lot of these kinds of how-to publications that come out in this period that are referred to as cookbooks. And so this tells his story of visiting Drop City and how the domes were made. There's many pages of sort of mathematical equations, etc., and how you might do this yourself. We also looked at the hand-built architecture of women's communes in southern Oregon, and so you see on the right the map of where these separatist feminist communes were at the time, and then on the left-hand side a picture of Jean and Ruth Mountain Grove, who were big players in this movement to create these separatist communities. And they too had their own sort of how-to books. Country Lesbians was their most well-known, and it sort of walks you through how you might recreate civilization from the ground up without patriarchy, and how you would do that, and the sorts of personal struggles that you would go through with your fellow you know, communards, I suppose. And then on the right-hand side this was the magazine that was published out of Woman Share, which was the commune that Gene Mountain Grove established. And Women's Spirit was also about rethinking many things, but especially spirituality, like what does a religion look like after patriarchy, and a sort of reformation of the goddess, and reimagining, let's say, a form of religion that's based on a connection to the earth. And then finally, I just wanted to put in some material about the collective Antfarm. Antfarm is fairly well known within the contemporary art world. I would say these other groups that I've been talking about, less well known, in some cases totally unknown. But Antfarm had a presence within the contemporary art world. They were architecture students who went on to advocate for inflatable architecture. And so they imagined a kind of network throughout the United States. You can see it on this placemat here, where you could go and sort of set up these kind of temporary zones of collectivity. And they also had a cookbook. So this is the Inflato cookbook, where you could learn how to make your own inflatables. And in fact, for the exhibition, at one point I asked them, like, okay, so how are we going to make this inflatable? Because we were going to include one. And they're like, well, we could just send you the Inflato cookbook. The instructions are all there. So the expectation was that we would also create that ourselves, and we did. It wasn't too hard. This is just examples of a variety of inflatable structures that they created for a number of different projects.
Can I just ask you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are these materials archived somewhere? I mean, these were,
yeah, so
in some cases, very transient organizations. You know,
right.
How did you find the materials?
Right. You know, I started, well, with Arcosanti and Cosanti, there is an archive at Arcosanti that I could go to and sort of unearth, you know, original photographs, details, etc. But in most cases, it was a lot of material in people's basements. And there was a long period of time of cultivating relationships with members of the counterculture who were really very reluctant to, first of all, participate in a large-scale institutional kind of exhibition. Not because, in some cases, because they lacked experience doing that, but in other cases were very sensitive to being publicly embarrassed and shamed, right? So there was a kind of trauma that they had after, you know, being dismissed in American culture. They have all kinds of stories about being in public or being invited to present their work in public and then being ridiculed, etc. So it took a long time to help them see that that was not what this exhibition was about, right? And there was, yeah, and so going back through those archives was fascinating, and it was just about putting those stories together. There's also a huge archive at the University of Oregon that holds the lesbian feminist papers of Jean and Ruth Mountain Grove, and also a number of other communes there. So that's very helpful. Okay, so all of these artists that were brought together in this study saw themselves as creative makers who were going to transform society through experience, essentially. New life patterns, let's say, whether that had to do with ecology or spirituality, architecture, etc. And in doing that, they really went far beyond any kind of modernist understanding of what art could be, you know, some sort of pure, transcendent, essentially visually oriented aesthetic pleasure, and toward a practice of kind of enacting alternative systems or lifestyles. And as you can imagine, a lot of this work is very resistant to object-based art historical analysis. And that's one of the reasons it hadn't been incorporated into the canon of, you know, American art of the 60s and 70s. And really, when you think about that, it's no surprise that when you do see the counterculture talked about within art historical circles, it's usually focused on psychedelic style or psychedelic posters. And this is because there's a kind of a concrete object and it's visually distinctive formal language. So in other words, when it is treated, it's treated as a style, when in fact when we look at a much more broader array of countercultural creative activities, it really should be more described as a lifestyle, right? Where there is, art is very much embedded within a way of living. And that is connected to the avant-garde credo of art into life, right? Because that was also very popular in the 60s, 70s. Robert Rauschenberg, understanding art is floating into life, etc. So they shared that theoretical tenet, but they went much, much farther than their avant-garde peers on the East Coast. And you know, for the avant-garde on the East Coast, I would argue that really the gallery or the museum kind of functioned as a laboratory for blurring what you might think of as art into life or art and life, but essentially it was a conceptual horizon, one that you were never really going to meet. It was just what you sort of pushed yourself against. It's a little bit of also the way that craft is often used in this period as a kind of conceptual horizon that you're never really going to reach, but you're going to flirt with in some way. So the utopian impulses of these artists, on the other hand, really demanded a much, much more thorough sort of melding of art and life that moved beyond really the confines of the art world. Now, let's see. And in doing that, I would also want to emphasize that it confounded these categories of art and craft, art and design, hierarchies between those categories, even hierarchies or other borders like architecture and design, or you know, sculpture. A good example would be the artists of the Drop City, where they really sort of extended their sculptural practice into dome building, and they understood that as their artwork. So the confounding of these kinds of categories or genres is also something that I've been thinking about and writing about in relation to the contemporary art world as well. Oh, I forgot to add, this is Marguerite Wildenhain at Antfarm, so another section of the handmade world is devoted to, there's one article that's devoted to her work there, and she had a very rigorous summer program where you spent all day throwing pots, but you were never allowed to keep them, and it was sort of destroyed. And so again, it really was about the experience of making was just about that experience of making, and that was meant to be sort of transformative for you personally and then socially as a member of the group. So let me go on to some contemporary artists that I've been looking at. This is an artist by the name of Josh Fott, and this is an installation called Longtime Companion from 2012 at Lisa Cooley Gallery here in New York City. And I have some details. It consists of about 8 or 10 wall hangings, and then you see these closet-like wooden structures. This is sort of the main piece. It's called It Takes a Lifetime to Get Exactly Where You Are. It's about 8 by 20 feet. And it's made, you can kind of see, of these woven strips. I'll read you the list of materials here. Hand-woven sequin trim, hand-woven hemp, cedar blocks, cotton, polyester, wool, dye, there's a straw hat, there's a jacquard woven reproduction of a panel of the AIDS quilt up there on the right, silk handkerchief, indigo dyeing, political pins, there's a disaster blanket, it goes on and on. There's nail polish, there's a number of other materials that have been applied to the piece. I have 2 publications coming out soon on the work of this artist. He's based in San Francisco and teaches fibers at the California College of the Arts. And his work is really representative of what I see as a kind of hybrid aesthetic sensibility of a prominent group of young artists who are steeped in craft, but addressing a much broader contemporary art audience. So they're kind of straddling those 2 worlds. In the case of Fott, he's very conscious about the way he blurs or melds those two worlds, so the world of craft and the contemporary art world. This particular series, I'll go back to this slide, consists of a group of objects that hold or sort of visually display archives, and they're both personal and unofficial. There's newsletters, there's greeting cards, there's how-to craft books from the 60s and 70s. You can see them there in the cabinet in the front. There's the replica of the AIDS quilt, which I mentioned, among a number of other objects. And they all represent aspects of Fott's personal history as well as the social and political histories of gay liberation and identity, specifically in the 1990s, which is when he came out as in that period. I have a couple of other examples so that you can see this. This is a detail of the large piece on the left-hand side there, And then on the right-hand side is a work that's titled Laugh All You Want, But Someday We'll Be in Charge. And you can see his use here of crochet, various forms of crochet, netting, and these political pins that he's attached to the top. So Fott has an MFA in fibers, and he's very well read in studio craft and sort of amateur DIY, even countercultural craft of the 60s and 70s. And he takes this knowledge, variety of fiber techniques, and filters it through what on the surface looks like very casual or amateur way of making. And his work, in fact, led to the coining of the term sloppy craft by the artist Ann Wilson when he was an MFA student at the School of the Art Institute. And one of my essays on his work will appear in an edited volume that's titled Sloppy Craft, and it looks at post-disciplinarity and contemporary craft. And the other focuses on Fott's interest in archives, particularly of what are thought of as queer or unofficial archives. And that's going to appear in an edited volume that the Smithsonian is doing on art and contemporary craft culture. So this kind of deliberate sloppiness, or de-skilling is another word that's often applied to his work, is perfectly in line with ways of making in the contemporary art world. And that world is really shaped by values that have been in place, since the rise of abstract expressionism, that's characterized by a rejection of skill and mastery and virtuosity. And I would also argue from the 1960s a kind of rejection of the standards of beauty that is used as a means to critique the art object itself. Now, this response to this hybridity, his deep interest in textile techniques and history, and this sort of melding of what you might think of as a casual, very amateur style of making, has been interesting, because for traditionalists in the fiber art world, who remain very wedded to standards of excellence that correspond to the overt display of skill or mastery of materials, this is a perplexing position. And sometimes he can receive, I've seen him in sort of conference situations where there is a hostile response to his work, to some much more traditional, coming from a much more traditional fiber world. On the other hand, one way to think about that is that it's a collision of two different art worlds, and they have very different relationships to materials and technique that he's trying to highlight here. And then the other thing that I think causes some controversy for him is just his tone. And that comes through in this casual, or what I sometimes refer to as amateur way of making, because he is very interested in the history of craft as a marginal practice, as something that sits on a border and is never fully, or can never be fully integrated. It's that craft's marginal practice has obviously been an issue that has long driven artists working in fiber, since at least the 1960s, if not earlier, to shun a variety of associations, to the decorative, to the amateur, to the sentimental, to the ornamental, to countercultural DIY movements. And this kind of behavior, this like shunning of those aspects of craft, you can, on some level, is a kind of shame. Shame of craft as a form of low culture that one wants to disassociate their work from. The issue is that for Fott, he's very interested in those issues and loves those aspects of craft. And he openly embraces things like the decorative and the sentimental. And there's absolutely no shame involved in it, and he's happy to talk about why he's interested in those aspects of craft. For him, he uses it to really discuss or talk about unofficial histories or forgotten histories, marginalized sexualities, cultural traumas such as AIDS, etc. And sentimentality also comes into play here with the way he uses or the way he highlights the handmade. I want to talk just very briefly about a couple of other artists who I also see as kind of part of this group of artists, or this circle of artists who are confounding those boundaries. And I'll just briefly, these are two other examples of Fott's work, just so you have an example of what he's been doing. And these are early works from 2007 or so. And this is one of his most recent pieces from 2013, installed in a columbarium in San Francisco. This piece is by Applebaum. It's called A Handweaver's Pattern Book from 2014. And it's installed in an exhibition that's at the Museum of Arts and Design right now called Pathmakers, Women in Art, Craft and Design, Mid-Century and Today. And that show opened last night. It's a really beautiful show. I highly recommend it. There's two parts of the show. One's historical, one focuses on contemporary artists, and Polly Applebaum is part of that contemporary group. And she's a great example of an artist who's long been interested in the history and theory of decoration and the decorative, and she uses it uses it in many of her works, which generally are made in a kind of cheap, shiny velvet, commercially produced velvet, which she then dyes. And they're mainly floor-based configurations. Let me just show you. This is the work that she's done previously, these beautiful pieces on the floor. And then this particular installation here, where she's got a grid of about 50 panels, all of them dyed with a stencil that is also creates this multiple grid pattern, is based on a book that she picked up, a how-to book, the Hand Weaver's Pattern Book, that was published in the 1950s for amateur weavers who wanted to create or wanted to weave at home. Of course, these patterns are illustrated in a grid formation, so that was something that she was interested in, and she sort of built off of that and made these hanging patterns. Her work generally brings into collision these competing geometric languages, the geometric or abstract languages, the geometric and the painterly, and kind of allows them to collide in very interesting ways. Another artist, here's a detail where you can kind of see the grid patterns, and then there's also all kinds of bleeding and, I wouldn't call mistakes, but sort of mishaps with the dye itself that she's quite interested in. Another artist who kind of falls into this category is Frances Cape, and this was an installation from 2013 that was here in New York. I forget the name of the gallery now. It's called Utopian Benches, and first of all, he was trained as a cabinet maker, so he entered the world into craft, and then made this leap into contemporary art world with projects like Utopian Benches. In this case, it's 17 benches that are meticulous copies of backless benches built and used in communal, mostly religious societies in North America from the 18th century to the present. And in general, Cape's installations sort of focus on the way that design and craft expresses beliefs. You see that repeated in his work, and this is probably one of the more brilliant examples. It came with a book that you see here, and I have the table of contents there where it shows you the communal religious societies that he's looked at, and then the book is really this detailed discussion of design decisions made by these groups and the purpose of that within their sort of theological understanding. And then finally, as the Wingate Research Curator for MAD, I am going to contribute to a catalog for an upcoming exhibition of the ceramic sculptor Peter Volkos. So that will focus on historical work, and then the catalog is going to branch out a little bit, and I'll be looking at the legacy of Volkos' style in contemporary art. So just to show you one example, I'm really at the beginning of this project. I'm just comparing it here to a piece by Rebecca Warham called Totem and Taboo from 2001, which sort of shares that visceral, kind of muscular manipulation of clay. I've also been long interested in the pattern and decoration movement of the late 70s and 80s, and I'm going to be presenting soon to our new chief curator, Shannon Stratton, a possible exhibition project that looks at that movement. Again, a movement that has sort of receded into the background as a kind of irrelevant decorative style, but one that interestingly crosses over between the art-craft divide. So I'll be working on that. Now, another category of my research and curatorial work is feminist-based, and it encompasses a number of different projects. And this is really the moment where I was able to make that leap from an academic world into a museum world. And it started with this program called Feminism and Company, which looks at issues of women and gender through the lens of creative practice. And instead of a kind of conference presentation style or panel discussions that you might find on an academic campus, The goal was to really bring alive public discussions about women, gender, feminism, by bringing people together who would otherwise never share a stage. So a good example, let me see, we had, we'll often have, a sociologist talking about a subject from one point of view, an artist working on a subject, and then maybe a performer who is also sort of tangentially related to a given issue. And we work together to sort of choreograph a program around a concept. So it runs the gamut. There are film presentations, dance performances, spoken word, and then there is a strong attempt to bring in a kind of scholarly or intellectual component too, that they kind of bounce off each other to create a very dynamic conversation. And I can talk more about some of the individual programs if you're interested. But I wanted to bring that in because that really was the opportunity I had to start thinking about scholarly and intellectual projects in ways that reached a much broader public audience. As Wingate Research Curator, I'm just at the tail end of editing a special issue of the Journal of Modern Craft that's functioning as an exhibition catalog for the show that opened yesterday, Pathmakers. That's going to come out in July, and I'm just showing you a range of images here. These are works that are in the exhibition. This is Ava Zeisel's Resilient Chair. We have work in the journal about her, and then Marion Stringel's commissioned rug for Alcoa Aluminum. We have essay on Magdalene Odundo's black ceramic wares that you see on the left, and Mary Walker Phillips' early knitted wall hangings. This is one from 1965. I'm contributing a short essay on Lenore Tawney's works on paper, one of which you can see on the left there. And then we also have a wonderful interview with Bela Jongorius, the Dutch designer who recently redesigned the UN's Delegate Lounge, which you see on the right-hand side. And then also Ruth Asawa's wire sculpture, and then Michelle Grabner's paperwork. So it really runs the gamut. We've tried to create an issue that brings together short-form essays that are about actual works in the exhibition, or recover some kind of lost history of someone. Many of these women were very well known in their day, so it's not really a typical recovery effort. They have just been slowly whittled from the history for many different reasons. 2 weeks ago, oh wait, let me see what I got here. Oh, this is an exhibition that I'll be opening in the fall. So this was a project that I already had in the works before I came to MAD and BARD. It's called the Improvisational Body. It's the sculpture and performance of Senga Ngudi. And I'm showing you here on the left an installation of a piece that's owned by MoMA. It's a pretty good example of her work, these sort of hanging sculptures that are weighted with sand and then pinned in different configurations along the wall. These works are fairly well known. We're putting them, I'm co-curating this with Nora Abrams at MCA Denver, and we're putting them into context because they were, in fact, many of them were performance tools that were used with dancers, and you can see a picture on the bottom right, Senga manipulating them, almost like a kind of puppet show there. And then she went on to work in performance for another 40 years. She's still working as a performance artist. So it will also focus on some private performances that she did, and then eventually various public performances that, again, incorporate a number of different ephemeral, very simple materials. In this case, elastic bands, and in this case, a performance called Masking, small bits of masking tape that she has just applied to a black bodysuit. And then the other thing last thing I wanted to mention was that just 2 weeks ago I opened my exhibition of retrospective exhibition of the painter and photographer Marilyn Minter. So that's at Contemporary Arts Museum Houston. I co-curated it with Bill Arning, who's the director there, and it will travel to MCA Denver, the Orange County Museum of Art, and then to the Brooklyn Art Museum. So we'll all be able to see it there. So I'll stop with that. I'm more than happy to go back to any of these projects or talk about, answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great introduction. I'd love to jump in and just kind of build on Eleanor's this question about how you get access, going back to the beginning of your talk, because it seemed to me that one of the themes that was running through your presentation is how do you, I think you answered that. You said a lot of it is recovery of things that are moldering mimeographs in people's basements, right? Others are more or less institutionalized, but
Right.
you use the word resistance to object-based historical analysis, both on part of some of the materials that seem to, the works that seem to resist, the creations that seem to resist this, but also communities that resist it because they've actually
Right.
decided to separate themselves. So I'm just wondering, how do you as a scholar, in the range of work that you do, how do you get from the recovery phase to the kind of still maintaining that sort of gold standard of the scholarly analytical voice? But I realize that in asking that, you've kind of started to answer it with something like your discussion of feminism in the company, which is, as what I hear you saying, is it's kind of an attempt to invent a new scholarly platform, or a new platform that bridges, worlds that seems appropriate to this audience. And you obviously yourself, have taken a not linear path, right? And decided to leave a kind of established academic environment for a much more entrepreneurial, curatorial one. So I just wonder if that stimulates any thoughts about how to do high-level analytical work in these areas, given the people and the objects and the institutions that are involved and all the baggage that each of those three.
It's true. It is a lot of baggage. It doesn't always work. There are people who just will reject it completely, and if this wasn't live casting, I could tell you stories.
You're going to be around, so.
Yeah. It doesn't always work because there are sometimes people who have interests in. Let's just go back to the counterculture example, because that was probably one of the more project with a lot of vexing issues related to this. There are people who have collections who really, really, really want it to be shown as art. Every single scrap of paper framed and put on the wall.
They think of them as collections.
They think of them as collections, and they're valuable collections, and therefore having them in an exhibition is important to them in terms of the status of the exhibition, the value of, or the collection, the value of it,
Ratifies that label.
Right. So we put together an exhibition that in the end didn't satisfy some of those collectors because they didn't like what they might think of as they didn't like the way ephemeral objects were treated. We tried to treat them as ephemeral objects. We're not going to frame every single mimeographed piece of paper and hang it on the wall. Instead, we had sort of big vitrines, and things were sort of laid out, not in any kind of chaotic fashion, but it certainly had a casual style that was acceptable to the artists who allowed us to borrow their works, right? So that satisfied their understanding of the way they wanted things to be presented because they didn't ever invest in the category of art in the first place, right? So, but that came into conflict with people who were actual collectors of this material, who weren't artists, and they were the ones to walk away from the project eventually. And so it took time to...
Should have stuck with the 18th century.
I know. So it took time to replace that work. It was, we didn't, in the end, it was not a problem, but that was an interesting conflict, right? And actually one that kind of shocked me because I thought that we were all on the same page, and we clearly weren't. But it did satisfy the artist involved, and maybe that's what the goal should have been in the first place. Now that I think back about it, it's the best outcome we could have had. And the style of the show did appeal to them, and they felt sort of mirrored their understanding of the time period and what they were interested in terms of aesthetics and how things should look. Things should not be precious. Things should not be presented as, high art. So really the issue with working with those artists was that they did feel so incredibly maligned once the 80s were ushered in with Reagan and the backlash against the counterculture. So they were extremely reluctant to be in public, be associated with the counterculture in public. But in the end, it became very gratifying for them. this is a group of people who are very serious about this work and are not here to make fun of us or think about it in some kitschy way. So
I'll just add as a link to the BGC that, you know, I mean, obviously we think a lot about both curatorial practice, but also like ethical dimensions of just scholarly practice in general. When I was listening to you talk, I was reminded obviously of Aaron Glass's, you know, conscious thinking about how how to involve indigenous communities in exhibiting work and returning work. And then even Ivan Gaskell, I was joking about the 18th century, but I think he wrote a very interesting article that was entitled something like Being True to Rubens, and it was a sort of reflection about how is one true to the material within the constraints of the institution, even if it's distant material.
Exactly.
Like, obviously, there's still that sense that.
The other issue was that so much of this work was experience-based, and how are you going to really represent that in a static form, right? So one thing these artists did do is keep everything, and they documented everything extensively. I mean, the amount of material is unreal, and especially when it came to video and photography. So we were able to incorporate a lot of original footage and do it in interesting ways. Like sometimes there's a filmmaker who's also working with original footage for some other project, and we were able to borrow some of that and really create. So each installation was quite immersive. There's usually some sort of immersive experience that you were going to have in the exhibition as well.
So were the people who were the collectors who objected to how some of the ephemera was presented, were they people who originally had been part of the movement, or they were collectors in the sense that we...
I mean, they're very dedicated. They have intense interest in the work, but they were not original members.
Right.
So how do they come to acquire those things, and in what context? And
it's curious. I never. In some cases, they learned about it through other contemporary artists who were also connoisseurs of a lot of this work, and started collecting through that. It's pretty random.
I mean, counterculture used to say if you weren't part of the solution, you were part of the problem. Something that's really, and it sounds like that's what's really
Where you're either on the bus or off the bus.
That was another one.
Exactly.
I have a question about kind of the political motivations and how within the West of Center project you might have navigated the parallels or contrasts that are happening today within some countercultures.
Right.
If you talked about them or referenced them at all, I mean, my understanding, which is very admittedly limited, is that within the 60s and 70s, it was a belief that the system would collapse and should collapse, and that these countercultures, could foster a new lifestyle, new community, new government or lack thereof. But there's similar groups now that are kind of trying to do similar things, but it seems less politically motivated and more of a being in a more disparaging perspective towards politics. And I'm just wondering if you've...
Right, so in the introduction to the book, we do talk about this pretty extensively, because the term counterculture used in that time period meant that you were going to replace the host culture with this new form, right? So it was pretty radical reformation, and had obviously utopian kind of tone to that. And then I think we briefly talked about, I'd have to look at it again, current counterculture formations, which are different in the sense that they're less utopian, and there is a kind of antagonism towards, like, say, government solving problems. But I would say that was probably the same with the counterculturals of the 60s and 70s as well. But what was most surprising was like the huge number of young people that came to this exhibition. Like, I wasn't expecting that. I was really expecting this generation, and they did come and they loved it, and we were very happy about that. But I was shocked at the number of young people who felt like this was, they strongly identified and connected, which was fantastic. It was just an outcome that I hadn't really thought about, or anything that we pursued in depth in the book. But it would be wonderful to do a follow-up project, and I have thought about that, like, oh, how do we compare these? Because they're not the same. They're definitely not the same. But they, and also what was kind of shocking was the lack of knowledge of the 60s and 70s, right? And that also has a lot to do with the 80s and 90s, you know, just like total backlash against these kinds of utopian environmental or social projects and beliefs. And so it became a sort of strange teaching tool in a way, I think, for a lot of young people. And then the other problem is that this work, talk about falling into a crack, you know, the new left had no interest in this work because they saw it as like just about the personal transformation. And in the art historical world, it was very difficult to even figure out how you would talk about it or integrate it into any kind of canon, right? And so it did sort of fall into oblivion because of that. And so to resurrect it was, I think, really satisfying for both the people who were involved originally and a sort of younger population who didn't really know that much about it.
I have another granular question.
Sure.
The Earthships outside of Taos, were they part of an artistic collective community as well, or is it?
Yeah, so it's kind of a legacy of a lot of the dome builders and that sort of thing. I remember I went out there. We did talk to the people who originated that. Went out there to look at them, and I can't remember the exact story, but it is a kind of direct contemporary legacy of this rethinking, house building and how to live off the land and that sort of thing.
On that note, are there any links with Black Mountain College and the kind of?
Not really. Marguerite Wildenhain is probably the closest at Pond Farm, where your educational experience was extremely unorthodox, right? And about experimentation and experience, didn't necessarily have to lead to the perfect pod or the perfect work of art or anything like that. That was almost just a secondary kind of outcome or goal. I'm trying to think of even older communes. No, again, you had, in the 1950s, a lot of those leftist small U.S. presses were also wiped out, right? The McCarthy era and that sort of thing. So there's these big gaps between these generations about looking back at, what had come before then. Timothy Miller is a scholar of American communes, and first volume, I think it's a 2-volume set. I mean, there's just hundreds, if not thousands, of these collective groups that started their own communities throughout the United States long before the 1960s.
Can I just ask a little bit your answer to that? And I was just thinking back to the problems that you presented at the beginning about what to call this material. And I hear you doing a lot in your whole work to kind of destabilize those categories and maybe convince us that we shouldn't obsess too much about it. And obviously now you work for an institution that's changed its name. We're always changing our name. We don't know what our name is. That sort of speaks powerfully. But when you mentioned a historian of communes, right? To what extent, whatever we call it, we're still approaching it through the artifacts, the visual artifacts, right? And so to what extent, how is this project different from what is the justification, I guess, and what does it say that we want to get to something, a big social issue like the counterculture through the presumably relatively few that really identified with some notion of art or design or making or creativity, which presumably was not all of them, or even the majority. Are we still distorting?
You mean like we still need to latch on to the object?
Why are we so interested in the object? And is that true? How would you defend yourself against a claim that said that's actually distorting of the broader picture? Or I presume your argument would be, no, it's a really, really important way in, and we bring our skills, me, Elissa, as a trained art historian, I have skills that can unpack this much broader phenomenon through this particular lens. Because I think we think a lot about that here. We say we're going to study history through objects.
Right.
And I think someone might say, well, there's a lot of other ways to study history. What's so special and great?
Yeah.
What's the justification for always focusing on objects?
I mean, I think in
most
this,
people don't.
yeah. So in this case, I would say, okay, first of all, it gives you an avenue into what I would argue is kind of a dominant experience for many counterculturalists, that it requires making. Like if you can have a utopian understanding of like, okay, I'm going to recreate civilization, but it does require you to make things with your own hands.
So your argument is actually that it is the essential component.
On some level, yeah. I mean, like sometimes I think, why didn't I have a section of the exhibition that was just called craft? Well, it's because it's just the unspoken thing. It's just there. It's everywhere, right? It just runs through everything. So it doesn't actually need to be pulled out. But sometimes you can't see it if you're not going to talk about it in those terms, like the hand making, which of course leads to objects, like whether it's architecture or handmade clothing or what have you. But I do think it's a fascinating way into a much broader concept of what it might mean to live an alternative life, whether ecologically or politically defined. Like that making of that world is really essential to imagining it. I guess that's my answer.
You didn't survive unless you made.
Exactly.
So
It's hard work. I mean, that's the other thing, the breakdown between like work, leisure, and creative practice is all fuzzy, because when I've gotten to know a lot of the artists who established Drop City and then a number of other dome building communities in southern Colorado. And, at the time there was a lot of press about, oh, there are a bunch of hippies who don't really want to do anything, they just want to kick back, blah, blah. I mean, they just worked all day long because there was no other way to survive. And so the amount of work that they produce is kind of amazing. But it was, for them, it was pleasurable because it was wrapped up in their own creative practice and then their understanding of how they were going to change their life.
Could you speak a little bit more about performance and performance art and Sengen and Booty's work and how
Sure.
you're dealing with performance art in
that particular exhibition?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that one's a little tough because what I have based on the performances are things like this. You can see there's a contact sheet in the back there on the right-hand side. And in this case, what I was able to do is take all those contact sheets, there's probably 10 or 15 of them, and then shoot them and then turn that into a moving image of her, right? Because she's an example of someone who really does not have a lot of original documents or footage of what she was doing. So there's that, and then I do have these, she has a number of slides, probably about 300 slides of various performances. But in this case, it's just going to require quite a bit of exhibition design to bring it alive, because there's limits to what you can do when it comes to performance. We have a performance costume, for instance, but I think we have one clip of her talking about a performance that she did in the mid-1970s. But it is limited, and so we also have these documentary photos of someone, her partner, Marion Hassinger, working and dancing with the sculptures, which you really can't do now, right? Because they're owned by other people. So you have to have her. It's possible that we could commission one that would allow us to have a performance, and other museums have done that too. So I think that's an option. But it's hard. Performance is very difficult, and it's it's a lot of it is like, oh, I wish you were there,
And it sounds like the ephemera is more limited because
It's
more
very
focused
limited. In her case, it's very limited. Yeah.
It's very interesting how those works actually resemble Ernesto Neto works.
I know,
yeah,
just like,
I thought it was Ernesto Neto at first, and I thought, no, that can't be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that too.
Yeah. Exactly.
So which came first then?
Oh, hers.
Hers, okay.
These are from the between she probably started experimenting with them around 1974, and these are from 1977. And there are some newer ones from 2012 12, 13, 14. So we'll be combining, I think, really some historic pieces and then some more recent versions. And the other thing that's hard with this is that it's difficult for her to remake work. So someone might own one of the pieces, but then to make it look like a historic photo is not easy. So they have they're very variable in terms of what they're going to look like when installed. And then they also respond to gravity, etc. Over time when they're exhibited. So they have a very malleable state of being.
Can you tell us about curating from the crypt?
Oh, sure. So there is a plan at the Museum of Arts and Design to reinstall the permanent collection on the second floor. That's also the floor where there's the permanent installation of the jewelry collection. So we'd like to have it all together there. And there's a new chief curator who was just hired a few weeks ago. She'll be here in June. Her name is Shannon Stratton. And so I thought it would be wonderful to sort of shadow the process of the permanent collection exhibition. And we have some great examples here in New York, for instance, the Whitney's reinstallation, and then I have some contacts at the Met for a couple of projects, one on 18th century silver, by the way, and I also want to be in contact with the curator who did the permanent installation of the Islamic galleries, because I think those are particularly stunning. So I want to look at a range of those projects and then also think about just the historical and institutional factors that impinge on that particular type of exhibition. And so in the case of Matt, it would be about learning the collection, which is unusual. It would be about changing institutional mission and what it is now. What do those installations look like in the past? How do you transform it to have that connection with institutional mission? And you can do the same thing for something like the Whitney, I think, too. So that would also be great comparison. And then there's aesthetic debates. You know, is it chronology? Is it thematic? That has raged for years at the Tate Modern. So there's those kinds of debates to look at too. And I will integrate, I think, some practical or practice-oriented exercises into the class that I think could be very interesting. I haven't had a chance to talk about this with Shannon yet. She knows I'm going to teach the class, but I think together we can work to come up with something that is both sort of intellectual and scholarly, looking at this very special type of exhibition, and then includes some practice-based exercises. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I think it's great because so much of the exposure to exhibitions that we currently provide students is about the temporary show, the problem-based show, and
Right.
the focus gallery, or something that's designed to be ephemeral and is really addressing a very particular, question. And I think, we've had less chance to see the formation of something that's meant to last for.
Right, yeah, and they're tough. They're very tough exhibitions.
What is the sense of how long
That's a good question.
an exhibition might last on the second floor?
I don't know, but definitely longer than a temporary show, because they're just
Probably
hard.
less long than Islamic. I don't think they're going to do that again.
Probably
too
not.
soon.
Yeah.
But they rotate. There's rotate objects in there?
I don't even know if they rotate objects. I think that one's pretty
I
solid.
bet they rotate textiles.
Probably.
Not all the textiles.
The textiles, for sure.
Yeah.
But that's also another interesting question. Like, when you put that amount of work into something, how long do you keep it up? Is this about,
Yeah, those are
the
great
questions go on
yeah.
and on,
Yeah.
how to do that. So I think it should be really interesting.
Yeah. Super.
Anything
Any other
else?
questions while we have her here, captive? Will that class just, I'll send around a notice about this video recording to those who couldn't come
Okay,
today, but
great.
will that happen here, there, combination?
I think it's going to be, right, so it's on Tuesday afternoons, I believe, right?
Yep. indeed.
So in some sessions will definitely need to be either at MAC institution, and then others where I think we'll just be working on readings or projects will be here.
Great. All right, stay tuned, pass the word.
Okay,
Elissa, thank you so much.
thank
We're so
you.
glad you're
This
here.
is wonderful to be here.